Welcome back to my podcast, Love and Courageous. I'm your host, Demetris, and today I'll be speaking about the unnoticed women of color suffragists. There are a lot of women of color who were suffragists who do not get the recognition that they deserve. A lot of times when people hear suffragists, they think of white women. So I really want to go into the Black women, the Asian women, the Native American women that have done a lot to fight for women's rights in America. So I want to get into some of the Black women. One woman whose name is Ida B. Wells, who was born in 1862 in Hollywood Springs, Mississippi. She was born into slavery during the Civil War. Once the war ended, Ida B. Wells' parents became politically active in the Reconstruction era politics. Ida B. Wells is known to work with white suffragists in Illinois. She founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was the first suffrage group for Black women. These women have campaigned neighborhoods and educated people on causes and candidates, helping to elect Chicago's first Black alderman, which is a member of city council. In 1913, Ida B. Wells and some white activists from Illinois traveled to Washington to participate in a suffrage parade where women gathered, cried out for a constitutional amendment for women to have the rights to vote. Now, however, Black suffragists were not allowed to go to this event. Now, Ida B. Wells and other suffragists wrote letters asking the parade to allow Black women to participate. The leaders officially agreed to allow Black women to march, but they had to march in the back of the parade because a lot of white women in the movement did not want the Black women there. However, Ida B. Wells refused to march at the back. Another Black suffragist is Charlotte Van Dyne Fortin. Born in 1785, she was an abolitionist and suffragist. Charlotte Van Dyne Fortin moved to Washington in the late 1870s with her husband, James Fortin, who was a wealthy sailmaker and an abolitionist as well. James Fortin was a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and his wife, Charlotte Van Dyne Fortin, and their daughters wanted to join, but women were not allowed to be a part of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So Charlotte Van Dyne Fortin and her daughters and other women decided to form the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. This was known to be the first biracial organization of female abolitionists in America. So James Fortin and Charlotte Van Dyne Fortin daughter, Harriet Fortin Purvis, was also a suffragist. Because she was a part of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, but she and her mother was also the founder of it. Harriet Fortin Purvis was also a member of the American Equal Rights Association, and she served as a member of the executive committee. Harriet Fortin Purvis and her sisters helped lay the groundwork for the first National Women's Rights Convention that was held in 1854 in October. And they also helped organize the Philadelphia Suffrage Association in 1866. But Harriet Fortin Purvis' sister, whose name is Margaretta Fortin, was also an abolitionist and an educator. Like I said earlier, their mother, Charlotte Van Dyne Fortin, Harriet Fortin Purvis, they were all founders and members of the interracial Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. So she also was involved in that as well. A lot of people in the family was really abolitionists because they had a niece whose name was Hattie Purvis. She was also a suffragist and was active in the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association, and she was a member of their executive committee. And between the years of 1883 and 1900, she served as a commissioner to the National Women's Suffrage Association. She also served as a superintendent of work among colored people for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Another black woman suffragist, whose name is Sarah Remont, born in 1826, she was an anti-slavery lecturer and a physician. Now, Sarah Remont also came from an abolitionist family, so she attended a lot of abolitionist meetings, and she was an activist in the Salem and Massachusetts anti-slavery societies and a member of the American Equal Rights Association, where she served as a guest lecturer, and toured in the Northeast campaigning for universal suffrage. Now, due to the split in the women's suffrage movement after the Civil War, she left the United States and moved to Florence, Italy in 1866, where she studied medicine. And I want to give a little fun fact on this. So I know the Seneca Falls is supposedly the first American convention to focus on women's rights, but the first convention to speak on the women's rights as an issue was actually in 1837 on May the 9th. The Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women in New York City. And a lot of black women attended this convention. And Marianne Shad Carey, Harriet Fortin Purvis, and Sarah Remont were a part of this. And these women believed in universal suffrage. So voting rights without regards to your education, your race, gender, or economic status. Another black suffragist is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was born in 1825 in Baltimore, Maryland, and she was born to free parents. But her parents passed away when she was young, so her aunt Henrietta and uncle Williams Watkins raised her. So her uncle William Watkins was an abolitionist, practiced self-taught medicine, and organized a black literary society. And he also started his own school in 1820 and called it the Watkins Academy for Negro Youth. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper attended her uncle's school, and this is where she learned about activism. When Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was 26 years old, she actually left Maryland and moved to Ohio, where she became an instructor at Union Seminary, a school for free blacks. Now, after she moved, Maryland passed a law stating that free black people living in the North were no longer allowed to enter the state of Maryland. And if these black people were found, they would be imprisoned and sold into slavery. Since Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was not allowed to return home, she decided to commit her efforts into the anti-slavery cause. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was also a woman suffrage leader. She attended conferences about these issues between the years of 1854 and 1890. She also wrote protest poetry that mentioned voting rights. She also wrote short stories and novels that focused on the issues of feminism, racism, and classism. Josephine State Pierre Ruffin was another black woman suffragist born in 1842. She was a Massachusetts journalist and abolitionist before the Civil War. She joined the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association in 1875. She was also a black women's club leader in Massachusetts and the wife of George L. Ruffin, one of the women's suffrage representatives from Boston in the state legislature. Josephine State Pierre Ruffin participated in a lot of clubs and serviced a lot of organizations in Boston. And one of her greatest achievements was the Women's Era Club. It was a club mainly for black women that was built in 1893. The club had two purposes. to address issues that affected the Black community, from education to local to politics to discrimination and terrorism of Black people in the South. And also, it offered members the opportunity for self-improvement. The women's era became the voice of Black club women. So Josephine State Pierre Ruffin and her daughter, Florida Ruffin Rodley, used this publication to bring Black club women to Boston in 1895, which was the first national conference of colored women in America. Nannie Helen Burroughs was another suffragist. She was born in 1879. She was an educator, a church leader, and she helped build the National Association of Colored Women in 1896 and found the National Training School for Women and Girls in 1909. Another suffragist is Ella Baker, born in 1903. She was a civil rights movement activist, and she played a key role in most of the organizations at that time, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1964, the SNCC helped create Freedom Summer, and this was an effort to focus national attention on racism in Mississippi and to register Black voters. Ella Baker and others believed that voting was one key to freedom. Another Black suffragist, Mary Church Terrell, born in 1863. In 1896, Mary Church Terrell and other activists founded the National Association of Colored Women, and she served as the association first president. After the 19th Amendment was passed, she decided to get into civil rights. And the last Black woman suffragist that I will mention is Mary Ann Shadd Cary. She was born in 1823 and was the first Black suffragist to form a suffrage association. In the 1850s, she was a leader and a spokesperson for the Black refugees who fled to Canada after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850. In 1853, she found the newspaper Provincial Freeman that showed interest to Black people in Canada. Mary Ann Shadd Cary spoke at the 1878 convention of the NWSA, applying the principles of the 14th and 15th Amendment to men and women. She called for an amendment to strike the word male from the Constitution. In 1871, she tried to vote in Washington but failed. In 1880, she organized the Colored Women's Progressive Franchise Association, which promoted suffrage and educated people on finance and politics. I want to get into the Fugitive Slave Act. I want to go into more depth about it. So the Fugitive Slave Act was a law that allowed slaves who were runaways to be captured and returned within the territory of America. The law was passed by Congress in 1793. Now, this gave local governments the authority to capture and return runaways to their owners and to penalize anyone who helped the runaways. Now, due to a lot of resistance to this Fugitive Slave Act being passed, this led to them passing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which added more rules and punishments towards runaway slaves and people who tried to help runaway slaves. Now, New York passed a 1705 measure designed to prevent runaways from fleeing to Canada, Virginia, and Maryland. And they offered money for people to capture and return the runaway and they offered money for anyone to capture and return the runaway slaves. Now, by the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, a lot of northern states, including Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, had already abolished slavery. Now, due to the politicians in the southern states, they decided to include a fugitive slave clause, which was stating that no person held to service or labor would be released from bondage in the event they escaped to a free state. Even though this fugitive slave clause was in act, a lot of people in the North still felt the same way about being against slavery. So during the late 1780s and early 1790s, a lot of people petitioned Congress to abolish the practice completely. But the fugitive slave clause stayed, and it also allowed the slave owners and their agents had the right to search for runaways in free states. And what would happen is they would capture a runaway slave, and the hunters had to bring them to a judge and provide evidence proving that this person was their property, or in other words, a slave. If court officials approved of the proof that was shown, which a lot of times took the form of a signed affidavit, the slave owner would be given the permission to take custody of the runaway slave and return them back to the plantations. The law also urged a $500 penalty fee on anybody that tried to help the runaways. But a lot of people in the North criticized the law, saying that the law basically was equivalent to legalized kidnapping. And also, a lot of people in the North decided to come up with an idea of watching out for bounty hunters in their state. Also, a lot of abolitionists organized secret resistance groups and built networks of safe homes to help enslaved people to escape to the North. And because a lot of northern states did not enforce this law, several states in the North passed a personal liberty law, which is saying that the accused runaways have the right to a jury trial. And this law also protected free blacks because a lot of times the bounty hunters would kidnap black people who was actually free, and they would be sold into slavery. The personal liberty law was also challenged in 1842 by a Supreme Court case called Prigg versus Pennsylvania. And this case is about Edward Prigg, a Maryland man who was convicted of kidnapping after he captured a black man that was suspected to be a slave in Pennsylvania. Now, the Supreme Court favored in Prigg, setting a prime example that the federal law override any state measures that attempted to interfere with the Fugitive Slave Act. By the mid-1800s, thousands of slaves have spewed into free states through Underground Railroad. Due to pressure from Southern politicians, Congress revised the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. And in this law, it forced citizens to assist in capturing runaway slaves. It also denied enslaved people the right to a jury trial. And they also increased the penalty for interfering with a runaway slave being captured and being sent back to their slave master. So anyone that tried to help the runaway slaves would now pay $1,000 in penalty fee and also face 6 months in jail. And to make sure this law was enforced, They also placed control of individual cases in the hands of federal commissioners. These agents were paid more for returning a slave who was a runaway than for freeing them. And a lot of people argue that the law was biased and in favor of Southern slaveholders. So states such as Wisconsin and Vermont passed new measures intended to bypass and even repeal the law. And this made abolitionists even more successful in their efforts to assist runaways. So by the 1850s, the Underground Railroad reached a peak, and a lot of enslaved people started to flee to Canada to escape U.S. jurisdiction. The Fugitive Slave Act was still unenforceable in a lot of northern states, and by 1860, there were 343 enslaved people that ran away, and out of that 343, 330 were returned back to their southern masters. Now, there were some politicians and congressmen that were trying to introduce bills to repealing the Fugitive Slave Act, but the Fugitive Slave Act continued until after the beginning of the Civil War. It wasn't until June the 28th in 1864 that the Fugitive Slave Act was repealed by Congress. So there was one man that I do want to mention. He was a slave. His name was Anthony Burns, and he was arrested and was sent to trial in Boston under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And this caused a lot of riots and protests by white and black abolitionists and the people of Boston during the spring of 1854. He was a runaway slave that lived in Richmond, Virginia, and was captured and sent to prison in Boston. And he was returned back to his master on a boat. And within a year after he was captured, abolitionists were able to raise enough money to purchase his freedom. That was all for the black women suffragists. So I'm going to get into the Native American women suffragists. One Native American woman suffrage was Maria Louise Bottinet Baldwin. She was born in 1863 and was a North Dakota Turtle Mountain Chippewa native. She spent most of her life defending Native American rights, and in 1911, she became a spokesperson for Native women. She participated in the 1913 suffrage parade, and a year later, she was one of many suffragists who met with President Wilson to encourage him to support women's rights to vote. Another Native American suffragist is Susette La Flèche Tibbles. She was also known as Bright Eyes for her work of advocating for her community. She was also an activist where she would go on a lot of speaking tours to promote Native American rights. And she also documented the adversity her community was experiencing. The last Native American I will speak on is Gertrude Simmons Bonnin, also known by Zicala Stahl. She was the first Native American writers who helped found the Society of American Indians to advocate for Native American citizenship rights. She moved to Washington, D.C. in 1916 and decided to spend the rest of her life doing political activities. She also served as the secretary of the Society of American Indians, edited its journal, and served as the lobbyist in Congress. Just in case anyone don't know what a lobbyist is, it's where someone organized activities focus on influencing public officials and members of a legislative body on legislation. Due to Zicala Shaw's work, it influenced the passing of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which gave American Indians their U.S. citizenship. I'm going to go into more depth about the Indian Citizenship Act. So Native Americans practiced self-governance way before colonization. After colonization, Native Americans was not considered U.S. citizens when the country signed its constitution in 1788. And it took 136 years just for Native Americans to be considered U.S. citizens. Now, even though black people gained their citizenship with the 14th Amendment in 1868, the government said that this law did not apply to Native people. Now, there was a law that was passed, and the name of it is the Dawes Act in 1887, passed by President Grover Cleveland. And in this law, what it was saying that the only way Native Americans would gain their U.S. citizenship was if they accepted individual land grants under the provisions of statutes and treaties. The federal government main focus was to assimilate Native Americans into the U.S. society by encouraging the Native Americans to get involved with farming and agriculture. And this was done to divide the tribal lands into individual plots. And due to this act, the government actually took over 90 million acres of tribal lands from the Native Americans, then sold that land to non-native U.S. citizens. So not all Native Americans accepted the allotment, but for the ones that did, they were given 160 acres of farmland or 320 acres of grazing land to the head of each Native American family. But the issue is that Native Americans were not used to living the life of ranching and agriculture, and the land that was given to them, which was already theirs, but due to the allotment, the land that they had was unsuitable for farming. Also, for Native Americans to receive their allotment, they had to enroll with the Office of Indian Affairs, but now it's known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Native Americans had to register themselves with the office, and their name went on the Dawes roll. And the government agencies were the ones to determine if the Native Americans were eligible to receive their allotment. I want to mention this. Before the Dawes Act, Native Americans controlled about 150 million acres of land. But when the Dawes Act was passed, and if they agreed to it, they lost majority of their land. And also, when they were paid for their land, they were underpaid. And this caused an issue of inheritance in the Native American community. Also, when the young children received their allotment, some of them did not know how to farm because they spent a lot of time in boarding schools when they were young. And also, when there are multiple inheritors, the land was too small to divide it among the children and to still be suitable for farming. And like I said earlier, the government took majority of the Native Americans' land and they sold it to non-native settlers. And this became the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was signed on May 20th, 1862 by President Abraham Lincoln. This law gave citizens up to 160 acres of land, and the only thing they had to do was pay a small registration fee. The government also granted more than 270 million acres of land while the law was in effect. So in 1924, Native American people won the full rights to citizenship when President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, also known as the Snyder Act. But a lot of Native people saw this as a way to break up the Native nation and to force them to assimilate them into the American society. An example of this was forcing young, indigenous people to attend boarding schools. Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of Carlisle Boarding School, was a school that a lot of natives attended. And in 1892, their mission was to kill the Indian in him and save the man. Also, when the Native American children attended the school, they were separated from their parents. And they were forced to cut off their hair, to leave their culture behind. They also could not speak their own languages, and their names had to be changed. Also, their clothing was changed as well. They were forced to wear uniforms. They were told to abandon their culture, their identity, because it was inferior to the white people. Native Americans had to fight for their own citizenship, but they also had to fight for their rights to vote. So the Constitution gave states the right to determine if the Native Americans had the rights to vote. And there were a lot of white people who did not want Native people to be voting in their states. Native people had to fight for their rights to vote state by state. But there's effort made to disenfranchise Native people, mainly the ones who lived on reservations, through the early 1960s. In 1957, after a challenge by an indigenous voter, Utah decided to repeal a law that denied Native Americans who were living on reservations the rights to vote. In 1962, the Supreme Court of New Mexico struck down a challenge that claimed Navajos living on a reservation in the state should not be able to vote in a 1960 election. Navajo, just in case anybody is wondering, is a member of North American people of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Even after Native American people were given some access to voting, they still were facing challenges such as literacy tests and poll taxes and also intimidation. The same things that were used against black voters. In fact, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helped strengthen the voting rights that Native American people had won in every state. Now, however, in 2013, the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder eliminated the Justice Department authority to block changes to voting laws in states with histories of discrimination. I want to mention a few facts here. So, Native Americans actually have the lowest voting rate of any racial group in America. Nearly 2 out of 5 of Native Americans who are eligible to vote are not registered to vote. And the reason for this is because a lot of Native Americans that live on tribal lands do not have a formal address, which is required for a state issue identification. Also, Native Americans faces a lack of resources for polling places, and this caused them to travel long distance to cast their votes. Only 54% of American Indian and Alaska Native live in rural areas versus 68% of them live on their tribal homelands. If anyone wants to educate themselves any more further on the challenges that Native people face in their own communities, here are a few things that you can do. Learn what Native land you're living on. Also educate yourself on how the Native American vote continues to be suppressed to this day. And if you want to keep update on the issues that Native Americans are still facing in their communities to this day, you can follow activists such as Sarah Eaglehart, Yonazda Alonwolf, and Anthony Thomas Pochel on social media. Also, by standing against racial discrimination by supporting the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And what this act would do is modernize and revitalize the Voting Rights Act of 1965, strengthening legal protections against discriminatory voting policies and practices. Now, this bill has been reintroduced in 2023 by House of Representatives, but it has not been reintroduced in the Senate. That is all for the topic for today. Now we'll get into the Black History Month fact. The Black History Month fact for today is about Kerry Hawley, the black man that invented the mobile device finder system. Kerry Hawley is a renowned inventor and technology consultant who has contributed to analytics and systems engineering. Now, while he was at IBM, he has been awarded several licenses for his groundbreaking inventions, including the mobile device finder system, a system that can locate lost mobile devices, and a process for maintaining functionality in the face of component failure. Now, however, his most remarkable invention is the IBM service-oriented architecture by transforming how businesses approach software development and integration. In 2003, he was named Black Engineer of the Year for the contributions he has made to the technology industry. So that is all for today. And for my next episode, I will finish the Unnoticed Women of Color Suffragists. I will talk about the Asian women and the Latina women. Thank you all for listening to my podcast, and I hope you all have a lovely day.